Nice car, shame about the face though. And that's the first thing any potential buyer's going to look at, so the pressure's really on to do a great job and an invisible fix. First thing I need to do is assess the damage and then call the body shop to get it booked in.
The air inside the McLaren garage in 2008 was heavy, smelling of scorched carbon and high-octane fuel, where a single heartbeat felt like an eternity. Marc Priestley stood at the center of that chaos, a mechanic waiting for a car to scream into a 2-second pit stop. It was a world of titanium and absolute perfection. Yet years later, he was standing in a damp Midlands workshop, holding a rusted hatchback part. F1 produces champions, but it also breaks the people who build the cars. How? Let's find out. The Woking Prison. To understand how someone walks away from the fastest cars on Earth, you have to look at the McLaren Technology Center in Woking, which Marc Priestley describes in his memoir, The Mechanic, as a place of absolute soul-crushing perfection. It's this massive glass and steel lakefront facility that looks more like a Bond villain's lair than a garage. And under the reign of Ron Dennis, the legendary but notoriously obsessive McLaren boss, the atmosphere was beyond intense. We're talking about a man who reportedly demanded that the floor tiles in the workshop be perfectly aligned with the grout lines, creating a space so sterile that you almost felt like a germ just by walking in. Marc spent a decade in this environment, and while the world saw the champagne and the trophies, the reality inside those glass walls was something much closer to a high-pressure prison. The schedule alone was enough to break most people, with Marc often taking over 100 flights a year, bouncing between time zones until his internal clock just gave up. According to an article from Sky Sports, being an F1 mechanic in the 2000s meant living in a state of permanent sleep deprivation, where you were expected to perform surgery-level precision on a car at 3 a.m. after a 20-hour shift. To cope with that kind of stress, the team developed this work hard, play too hard culture that sounds like something out of a movie. They'd spend all day chasing millisecond gains in the pit lane, and then spend the night engaging in legendary pranks and chaotic nights out just to feel human again. It was a cycle of mechanical isolation where your entire identity was swallowed by the car and the brand. Then you have the external drama, like the Stepney Gate spy scandal in 2007, which turned the garage into a paranoid bunker. Marc was right in the thick of it, feeling the weight of the massive fines and the political warfare between McLaren and Ferrari. It wasn't just about racing anymore. It was about surviving a toxic, hyper-competitive vacuum. Think about that for a second. Living in a world where you're surrounded by the best technology ever made, yet you're too exhausted to even appreciate it. There's a moment Marc talks about where he realized he simply couldn't sign up for another season of giving his entire life to a machine that didn't love him back. He'd reached the summit, seen the view, and realized it was just more gray walls. He eventually made the leap and escaped the suffocating pressure of the pit lane. But here's where it gets interesting, because the world of television he was heading toward was about to face its own internal collapse. The California collapse. While Marc was figuring out how to survive the clinical perfection of McLaren, the show he'd eventually call home was busy making a move that almost ended it for good. Wheeler Dealers had always been this gritty, grease-stained staple of British television, but in an effort to conquer the global market, the production packed up its wrenches and headed to Huntington Beach, California. On paper, it sounded like a dream: palm trees, sunshine, and a massive American market. But the reality was a complete culture shock that nearly alienated the people who had watched the show since day one. According to a report by The Hollywood Reporter, this Americanization was the primary reason the legendary Ed China decided to walk away in 2017. He felt the show was moving away from the detailed, hands-on mechanical deep dives that made it famous and shifting toward a lifestyle format that prioritized flashy B-roll over actual engine work. Discovery's internal shifts were leaning heavily into this polished Hollywood-style aesthetic, and while Ant Anstead, the charismatic builder who stepped in to replace Ed, was absolutely a hit with the cameras, the show started to lose its shed-built tool. It felt less like two blokes fixing a car in a rainy British garage and more like a high-budget parody of a car show. Fans were brutal about the change, and the backlash to the two perfect US episodes was loud enough to be heard across the Atlantic. They missed the grit, the struggle of a rusted bolt, and the relatable feeling of working in a space that wasn't constantly bathed in California golden hour light. And then, just as the production was trying to find its footing in this new world, COVID-19 hit and essentially ground everything to a halt, forcing everyone to realize that to survive, the show literally had to go home. It's a strange thing when you think about it, because we often assume that bigger means better in the world of television, but sometimes the magic is actually in the limitations. Have you ever seen a brand or a person try so hard to appeal to everyone that they end up losing the very thing that made them special in the first place? For wheeler dealers, the realization was stark. They needed the damp workshops of the English Midlands more than they needed the sunshine of SoCal. But the return to the UK wasn't going to be a simple homecoming. With Aunt Anstead deciding to stay in the US for personal and family reasons, Mike Brewer found himself in a tough spot. He had the show back on British soil, and he had the workshop ready to go, but he was missing the one thing that makes the whole engine run: a mechanic who could actually handle the heat. The 48-hour pivot. Here is the thing about television. When a show is bleeding out, you don't look for a fresh face. You look for a savior. Mike Brewer was standing in a workshop in Oxfordshire with a show that was practically on life support after the California experiment. And he knew he didn't just need a mechanic, he needed a miracle. Now, most people think Marc Priestley just happened to be in the right place at the right time, but it wasn't a lucky break. According to an interview in the Evening Standard, Mike and Marc had already spent time testing their chemistry on the spin-off series Wheeler Dealer's Dream Car. That little pilot was actually a secret audition for the biggest job in car TV, and the rapport they built while helping people trade up to their hero cars proved that Marc wasn't just a host. He was a massive technical asset. The transition happened with a speed that would have made a McLaren pit crew proud. While the 2020 lockdowns were forcing the entire world to stay inside, the production team was orchestrating a massive 48-hour pivot to move the show back to the UK and install Marc as the new lead mechanic. It was a high-stakes gamble, because they weren't just changing a presenter. They were trying to win back the technical credibility they'd been losing ever since Ed China walked away. Marc brought this incredible F1-level diagnostic rigor to the table, and suddenly, a 20-minute TV slot wasn't just about lifestyle, it was about real engineering. He was treating a rusted Fiat the same way he'd treat Lewis Hamilton's championship-winning MP423, and that precision was the exact antidote the fans were screaming for. It's actually fascinating to watch the contrast between the two of them on screen. You have Mike, who is the personification of wheeler-dealer energy, loud, fast-moving, and always looking for the hustle. And then you have Marc, who is calm, clinical, and precise. But wait, it gets even weirder when you realize that this pairing shouldn't work on paper. Yet, it's the very thing that saved the show. Marc was essentially hired to be the technical backbone of the operation, making sure that every wrench moment felt authentic again. Think about the mentors or partners you've had in your own life. Was there ever a time when someone completely different from you actually made you better at what you do? For Mike Brewer, Marc was that missing piece. He didn't just fill a vacancy, he changed the entire temperature of the workshop. However, the F1 mechanic quickly found that fixing a car for a camera lens is a completely different beast than fixing one for a podium. And the reality of television production was about to give him a very loud wake-up call. Precision versus production. The culture shock Marc experienced when he swapped the Formula One pit lane for a television set was, quite frankly, a total collision of two completely different realities. On his YouTube channel, F1 with Elvis, he gets incredibly honest about the faking of TV versus the absolute truth of elite engineering. In the world of McLaren, if Marc needed a bespoke titanium bolt, it would be machined and delivered to his hand in a matter of hours. Because when you have a £100 million budget, physics is the only thing that limits you. But on Wheeler Dealers, he suddenly found himself scouring eBay at midnight for a month just to find a door handle for a Peugeot. It's a massive psychological shift to go from a world where cost is irrelevant to one where a £500 mistake could literally blow the entire profit margin of the episode. Here's where it gets really interesting though. TV production isn't about the car, it's about the shot. And that created this constant friction between Marc's need for perfection and the director's need for speed. In F1, you do a job until it is mathematically perfect. But in television, you're often fighting a daylight schedule and a crew that needs to wrap by 6 p.m. According to an insider feature on Crash.net, the life of an F1 mechanic is built on the idea that cutting a corner is practically criminal. Yet, reality TV sometimes demands that you make it work just for the camera. Marc had to navigate that uncomfortable middle ground where his professional pride met the reality of a 5,000-pound car flip. And honestly, it's a miracle his head didn't explode in the first season. But wait, there's a twist to this that actually made the production team fall in love with him. Because of that F1 background, Marc was so precise that he rarely made mistakes, which actually made the show cheaper and faster to produce in the long run. He didn't need a take two on a complex repair because he'd already performed it with the muscle memory of someone who used to change tires in 2.5 seconds under the floodlights of Singapore. It's that level of discipline that brought a new kind of gravity to the workshop. Think about the last time you had to do a job with half the tools and half the budget you actually needed. It's frustrating, right? Now imagine doing that with a camera crew watching your every move, waiting for you to fail for the sake of good TV. Marc managed to keep his cool, but as he settled into the rhythm of the workshop, he started to realize that there was a human cost to walking away from the pinnacle of motorsport that nobody was really talking about. And it was starting to catch up with him. The Ant Shadow. Stepping into a legacy show like Wheeler Dealers is a bit like trying to replace the lead singer of a world-famous rock band, and for Marc Priestley, the initial reception was anything but welcoming. When he took over the wrenches in season 17, the internet did what the internet does best. It revolted. According to social media sentiment tracking from that period, the fans were initially quite hostile toward him, largely because he was being compared to Ant Anstead, who had this high-energy, almost cinematic presence on screen. People were calling Marc boring or too serious, simply because he wasn't jumping around or playing to the cameras with the same Hollywood flair that Ant had mastered during the California years. It's an uncomfortable truth in television that successors almost always fail if they try to be a carbon copy of the person who came before them, and Marc was standing right in the middle of a fan-fueled firing squad. Now, here is where it gets interesting, because while a Twitter spat was erupting between Mike Brewer and Ant Anstead over the show's direction, Marc did something incredibly smart. He stayed completely out of the drama. According to reports from The Sun and the Birmingham Mail, Mike was taking a lot of heat from fans who felt Ant had been pushed out, but Marc just kept his head down and focused on the cars. He didn't try to match Ant's energy. Instead, he leaned into his own technical truth. He became the professor, the man who could explain the fluid dynamics of a gearbox with the same calm precision he used at McLaren. He was betting on the idea that the fans would eventually stop looking for a character and start looking for an expert. That shift in tone, moving the show away from pure entertainment and back toward engineering, was exactly what saved his reputation. There was this specific moment during the Golf GTY episode where you could literally feel the audience's collective guard drop. He wasn't just fixing a car, he was diagnosing it with a level of rigor that felt like a masterclass. And suddenly, the comments section started to change. The fans realized that while they might have lost a star, they had gained a legitimate master of the craft. It was the moment he officially stepped out of Ant's shadow and carved out a space that was entirely his own. Think about a time when you had to prove yourself to a group of people who had already made up their minds about you. It's an exhausting mountain to climb, isn't it? Marc managed to reach the top by simply being the most competent person in the room. But while the fans were finally beginning to embrace him, Marc was quietly dealing with the fallout of his own choices. Because, as it turns out, while the world was finally happy with the cars he was building, he was starting to realize that his own mental health had been neglected for far too long. How would he cope? The restoration of Elvis. This is where the story shifts from being about cars to being about the person underneath the grease. Because what's really happening here is a complete restoration of the man himself. We often look at people like Marc Priestley and assume they've got it all figured out. But there's this high-performance trap that exists in elite sports, where your value is tied entirely to your output. If you're a tenth of a second slow, you're obsolete. According to Marc's advocacy work with the mental health charity Mind and his frequent discussions on the grueling nature of the pit lane, he's been incredibly open about how that environment is a breeding ground for burnout. Formula One is a world historically steeped in a kind of toxic masculinity, where admitting you're struggling is seen as a mechanical failure. And for a long time, Marc was just another part of that machine, redlining until he was ready to snap. But here is where it gets really beautiful. He actually used wheeler-dealers as a form of occupational therapy. Think about that for a second. After years of working on multi-million-dollar machines where a single mistake could get you fired, or worse, he transitioned into a world where the stakes were just a few £1,000s and a happy new owner. The slow world of restoration allowed him to reconnect with the actual joy of engineering without the looming threat of a global leaderboard. In a review of his book by Motorsport magazine, it's clear that the clinical, sterile world he left behind didn't offer the same soul-satisfying reward as taking a normal car that someone's grandmother used to drive and bringing it back to life. He wasn't just fixing engines anymore, he was fixing his own relationship with the craft he loved. Now, it's not just about his own peace of mind. Marc has taken that F1 discipline and turned it into a way to mentor the next generation. Through his platforms, he's become a vocal advocate for mental health in motorsport, pushing the idea that you can be elite and vulnerable at the same time. He realized that the fame that comes with being on Discovery Plus was just a byproduct, because the real goal was simply staying sane. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes you have to step down from the peak of the mountain just so you can finally enjoy the view. I'm curious, though, have you ever had to walk away from something you were technically successful at just to save your own head? For Marc, the answer was a resounding yes. It's why he looks so genuinely happy when he finally gets a stubborn old engine to fire up in that Midlands workshop. So, when you see him smiling on your screen, just remember that he's not just fixing a car. He's celebrating the fact that he finally found a way to be human in a world that usually only values the machine. He's a survivor of the fastest life on Earth, and he's finally found his own pace. Marc Priestley's journey wasn't a step down, it was a life-saving pivot. He traded the sterile perfection of the McLaren pit lane for the honest, gritty grease of a British garage. And honestly, the show is better for it. So, what do you think? Is Marc the most technically gifted host we've ever seen? Drop your thoughts about it in the comments below.